George Boldt was 13 when he arrived in America from Prussia, young enough to be underestimated and old enough to understand that nobody was waiting to make his life easy. He worked where opportunities appeared: kitchens, dining rooms, hotel service, the invisible side of luxury where other people entered through the front doors, and men like George learned to notice everything. A table set badly. A guest waiting too long. A room that looked expensive but felt cold. Years later, people would know him as the man behind some of America's grandest hotels, but before the Waldorf, before wealth, before Hart Island, George was learning a skill that would define him. He could walk into a room and see what other people missed. Then came Louise Carer. She grew up around hospitality too, the daughter of William Carer, who worked in Philadelphia's elite club world. When George and Louise married in 1877, they were not yet the couple visitors would one day romanticize through an unfinished castle. They were simply beginning. George was 26. Louise was very young, about 15, a fact that should not be hidden beneath modern romance. What matters is what followed: 26 years of marriage, 2 children, extraordinary financial change, and a partnership that seems to have become more intertwined as George's ambitions grew. Their son, George Jr., arrived in 1879. Their daughter, Louise Clover, followed in 1883. The children did not grow up watching a father who had always been rich. They watched a man becoming rich. That difference matters. George's world expanded through work. He moved deeper into hotel management, developed a reputation for exacting standards, and discovered that wealthy guests would pay astonishing amounts for one thing money did not automatically create: the feeling of being understood. He wanted flowers fresh, service precise, food memorable, rooms elegant without appearing mechanical. Louise appears in the historical record not simply as someone waiting at home for his success. Accounts of their hotel years describe her influence on atmosphere, decoration, hospitality, and the ways women experienced spaces that had often been designed around male customers. If George saw the machinery of service, Louise seems to have understood the emotional temperature of a room. That makes them more interesting than the usual legend. He did not simply become successful and then buy romance. They were learning the business world together while raising children inside it. Imagine the family table after an exhausting hotel evening: George still thinking about a dining room problem, Louise knowing exactly which guest had felt neglected, George Jr. listening, Clover too young to care about any of it. We cannot invent their private dialogue, but we can see the pattern. The children received strong educations. George Jr. went to Lawrenceville and later Cornell. Clover attended Spence in New York. They spent summers with their parents among the Thousand Islands, where life could briefly become boats, water, trees, family guests, games and long evenings instead of hotel corridors. George was not easy in the sentimental sense. He was demanding, ambitious, highly conscious of standards and social position. He built businesses for the wealthy and understood exclusivity as a commercial weapon. But there is another George in the record, a man who quietly helped students afford college, supported hospitals and charities, assisted people in financial difficulty, and later asked his children to continue charitable giving after his death. That contradiction is important. He liked success. He pursued status. He could be controlling. Yet he also remembered what it meant to begin without privilege. His children would later honor him through educational gifts, suggesting that whatever tensions existed inside the family, they did not grow into adults eager to erase him. And Louise had known George before almost anyone had reason to be impressed by him. She knew the worker before the hotelier, the father before the tycoon, the immigrant before the man society wanted at its tables. Long before Hart Island became famous, George and Louise had already built the thing the castle would later try to contain: a family with history, habits, disagreements, ambitions, children, private memories, and 23 years of marriage before the first great stone walls began to rise. A castle can make a marriage look inevitable in retrospect, as though every year had been leading toward Hart Island. Real marriages are not like that. George traveled, worked relentlessly and lived under enormous professional pressure. Louise raised children while participating in the social world around him. Their success brought comfort, but also obligations, guests and employees. If their bond endured, it endured inside that reality. By the time George Boldt reached the Waldorf-Astoria, he had become the kind of man who could cross a lobby and make everyone around him slightly more alert. Not because he needed to shout. Because he noticed. Picture New York at the height of the Gilded Age, carriages arriving one after another, women in elaborate evening gowns, businessmen conducting deals over dinner, orchestras playing, porters moving trunks, waiters balancing impossible demands, and somewhere in the middle of it George observing the entire machine. A guest has been seated too long. A floral arrangement looks tired. A waiter's coat is wrong. A dinner service is losing rhythm. George understood that luxury was choreography. One mistake did not ruin a hotel, but enough small mistakes could destroy the illusion that everything happened effortlessly. That instinct made him successful, but it also raises a more interesting question: what was it like to be his child? George Jr. grew up with a father whose standards were visible everywhere. The family name was becoming synonymous with hospitality, and eventually George Jr. worked within the business himself. But he never seems to have possessed his father's relentless appetite for expansion. That difference gives us something more human than a neat dynasty. Perhaps a father can give his son every advantage and still discover that the son does not want to become the same man. There is no surviving record of a dramatic confrontation between them, and we should not invent one. But George Jr.'s later life suggests a gentler relationship with ambition. He participated in the family enterprises, yet he did not become another George Sr. conquering hotel after hotel. Clover's path was different again. She grew up surrounded by wealth, social expectation, and a mother who appears to have had real influence over the way the Boldt world felt. She attended an elite girls' school, moved through the social world created by her parents, and later carried her father's memory into philanthropy. The point is not that George raised perfect children. The point is that he raised two children who were close enough to the family legacy to continue parts of it without simply copying him. Louise seems essential to that balance. Accounts from the hotel years repeatedly place her inside George's professional world, helping shape atmosphere, hospitality, and the experience of female guests. That makes her more than the woman he loved. She was someone whose judgment George apparently valued. One small story captures this better than 100 romantic adjectives. Louise reportedly considered 13 lucky and influenced George's embrace of the number. Whether every later retelling is exact or polished by family lore, the image is useful because it shows a man famous for controlling details still allowing his wife's preferences into the architecture of his decisions. George may have been the public force, but Louise had room to shape the world around him. Their children grew up watching that partnership. Then the Thousand Islands gave the family something New York could not. On the street Lawrence, status remained, but the rhythm changed. Boats replaced carriages. Water replaced hotel lobbies. The children could explore. Friends arrived by launch. The family used Ulster Tower for recreation, with spaces for games, music, and entertainment. George could still turn leisure into a project, but now the project belonged to the family. Hart Island was not yet the great castle tourists photograph today. It was a place where the Boldts spent time together before anyone knew it would become the physical evidence of their story. This is where the castle should first enter our film, quietly. Not as a grand reveal. George stands near the water looking across the island. Louise is nearby. Their children are older now. A boat is tied at the dock. The family has already experienced years of success, work, pressure, and change. George has spent his career designing places where strangers celebrate weddings, dinners, business victories, and reunions. Then he begins imagining what he can create for his own family. Not a monument. Not a mausoleum. A future. That is the emotional turn. Because once we understand the father, the husband, the children, and the life already happening on Hart Island, the castle no longer looks like proof that a rich man could spend money. It looks like a man trying to build enough room for everything he believed was still ahead. Their children would have known the difference between the public George and the private one better than anyone. Hotel guests saw the polished host, employees saw the perfectionist. George Jr. and Clover saw the man after the evening ended. That missing private record makes their later choices more revealing, because children often show what a household valued by what they choose to preserve. Around 1900, Hart Island changed scale. Hundreds of workers arrived. Stone came by boat. Scaffolding rose above the trees. Drawings spread across tables. The project that would become Boldt Castle grew into 6 stories and roughly 120 rooms, but numbers are the least interesting part of it. Look instead at 3 spaces. A family dining room? A ballroom. Rooms intended for George, Louise and the children. Each one assumes something. Dinner assumes everyone comes back to the table. A ballroom assumes there will be evenings worth celebrating. Family rooms assume children return, guests arrive, marriages happen, perhaps grandchildren appear. George was building architecture around expectations. And Louise was alive while he did it. This matters because the famous version of the story is often told as though George secretly constructed a giant romantic gift for a passive wife. The historical picture is more interesting. Louise had already spent decades helping shape the Boldt household and hotel world. She knew the Thousand Islands. She used Hart Island with her family. She appears to have participated in the life surrounding the project. The castle was romantic, certainly, but it was also practical in the strange Gilded Age sense of practical, a family compound for people whose lives had become very large. George Jr. was becoming an adult. Clover was approaching adulthood. The household was changing. Their parents were no longer the young couple who had married before George's fame. They had become the center of a family whose children would soon begin building separate lives. That gives the castle another meaning. Perhaps George was not simply trying to impress Louise. Perhaps he was trying to keep everyone connected to one place. We cannot prove that was his private intention, but the spaces he planned make the possibility emotionally legible. Family homes often become most important just as children are preparing to leave them. George had spent decades building hotels designed for people to come and go. Hart Island could be the place where his own family returned. And for a time, everything appeared to be moving toward completion. Workers shaped stone. Gardens took form. The river carried materials and guests. George continued managing business pressures in New York while the island rose. Louise's health, however, was not as permanent as the castle walls. In January 1904, she died suddenly in New York from heart trouble. She was only in her early 40s. This is where the story must resist melodrama, because George's next action is stronger than anything we could invent. The message reached Hart Island: stop all work. Imagine the sequence from the worker's side. A carpenter has a measurement half finished. A mason is fitting stone. Someone is carrying material toward a room that will never be completed for the person who was meant to live there. A foreman receives the order. Conversations stop. Tools are lowered. Men begin leaving the site. Boats pull away. The island, which had spent years sounding like construction, becomes quiet. George Boldt had built his career by solving problems. Hotels presented problems every hour: staffing, guests, money, food, reputation, logistics. His instinct was to fix, improve, finish. Yet Hart Island was different. After Louise died, he never restarted the work. According to the castle's official history, he never returned. That tells us more than any sentimental statement that he loved her deeply. We do not know every thought that passed through his mind. We do not know whether he looked at the plans again, whether someone suggested finishing for the children, whether George Jr. or Clover ever asked him to reconsider. The record is largely silent where modern curiosity is greatest. But the decision remained. Stop. Now consider the children. George Jr. was 24. Clover was about 20. They lost their mother just as both were entering adult life. And their father, the man who had always seemed capable of making something happen through will and organization, had encountered a fact he could not manage. The 3 people who remained still had to go on. George returned to work. George Jr. finished Cornell. Clover continued into adulthood. The family did not disappear because the castle stopped. That is the deeper heartbreak and the deeper strength of the story. After the grand romantic gesture ended, parenting remained. Bills were paid. Decisions were made. Careers continued. The father who could not finish Louise's castle still had to help his children build lives beyond her. George also did not turn Louise's death into public theater. He could have completed the castle as a memorial. Instead, the project remained unfinished. Whatever lay behind that choice, he left no grand explanation to compete with the physical fact: the building stopped. George Boldt lived 12 years after Louise died, and those years matter because they reveal whether the castle was the center of his life or only one expression of it. He did not retreat permanently from business. He continued leading, investing and giving, moving through hotels where other families celebrated the kinds of milestones his own family had just lost. Imagine the contradiction. A wedding reception fills a ballroom under George's management. Flowers arrive. Champagne is poured. A bride descends a staircase. Staff make everything appear effortless. George has spent his life creating beautiful environments for other people's futures, while hundreds of miles away his own grand family house remains unfinished. He could have completed it. Money was not the obstacle. Labor was not the obstacle. Architectural ambition was not the obstacle. He simply did not resume it. Yet he did continue being a father. George Jr. entered the family business and, after George Sr.'s death, briefly took leadership responsibilities, though he never became the same kind of relentless builder his father had been. Clover formed her own adult life. Both remained connected enough to their father's values that later they supported education in his memory. George Jr. established Cornell scholarships associated with his father, recalling George Sr.'s sympathy for ambitious young people who lacked money for college. Clover also made a major Cornell gift in his memory. Those choices do not prove an uncomplicated childhood, but they make one conclusion difficult to ignore: the children did not remember their father only as a demanding tycoon. They remembered something worth honoring. George's will gives us another clue. When he died in 1916, he divided his enormous estate equally between George Jr. and Clover and asked that the charitable causes he had supported continue. A son who did not share his father's exact ambition was still trusted. A daughter received equal standing in the estate. Both inherited not just wealth but an expectation about what wealth should do. That does not make George a saint. He catered to elite society, understood status, pursued profit, and demanded standards that could make him difficult. But it makes him harder to reduce to either romantic hero or robber baron. He was an immigrant who became rich serving the rich, a perfectionist who helped people quietly, a father who gave his children privilege but also education and responsibility, and a widower who continued building almost everything except the one place most intimately connected with Louise. The heart is earlier. Return to a summer before 1904. A boat approaches Hart Island. George is there. Louise is alive. George Jr. and Clover are with them. The children are old enough to be becoming themselves but young enough that the family still belongs to one household. The river is bright. Workers are visible in the distance. George is already successful, already demanding, already planning something larger. Louise knows the man beneath that public figure because she knew him before the world did. The children know a different George again, the father whose standards shape their lives, whose wealth gives them opportunities, whose work sometimes dominates the room, whose generosity they will later preserve in their own ways. None of them knows this summer will someday be remembered through an unfinished castle. That is the ending I would trust. Long before tourists called Hart Island a monument to love, George and Louise had already spent more than 2 decades doing the less photogenic work of marriage, building a household, raising children, navigating ambition, surviving change, sharing professional life, disagreeing, adapting, watching their children grow. The castle came afterward. It made their story visible because stone survives longer than conversation. But the stone is not what makes George's decision in 1904 powerful. The power comes from knowing the people who were supposed to live inside it. George did not begin building Boldt Castle because Louise was gone. He began while she was there, while their children were growing, while the future still looked ordinary enough to assume it would arrive. When Louise died, he stopped the building, but he did not stop being responsible for the people who remained. That may be the most human part of the story. Love was not only the castle he abandoned. It was also the family he continued to carry after the dream changed. And if you enjoyed meeting the people behind this extraordinary place, like this video and subscribe to Historia, because the greatest buildings in history are often only the scenery. The real story is the people who believed they still had time. Decades later, strangers would restore the castle, but they could never restore the family moment it was meant to hold.